Chapter 13, Hetty Scott. The scream came from the direction of the cornfields, and after it, I could hear the muffled echoes of gunshots and the sad bawling sound of hunting dogs chasing something in the fields. Cursing, the riverman leaned back, pulled hard on the oars. Only thing me and Harrison could see was the dark wall of his shoulders in front of us, coming back and forward, pulling hard as he could on those oars, trying to get us into the river fast. Hugging my arms around my knees, I hunched down as the old boat creaked and rocked into the shallows. The water thumped on the wooden sides, and it sounded like 100 terrible hands knocking to come in. Another scream came across the cornfield, closer this time. "Put out your lantern," the man hissed over his shoulder. Water splattered over us as he swung the oars out of the water. Harrison fumbled with to catch the lantern, trying to open it. "I told you, put out that lantern," the man snapped. Turning around suddenly, he smacked the lantern out of Harrison's hands. It clattered into the wet floorboards of the boat, sputtering and hissing. Harrison gasped sharp and then grew quiet. Keeping his head down, he whispered, "Don't you worry, Samuel. Everything's going to be all right." But nothing was going to be all right. I knew it. I could hear the sound of a terrible chase coming from the cornfield, the crack of gunshots, hunting dogs, bawling and chopping, men hollering. "Here, over here," sounded as if they were chasing someone toward the riverbank, same as they would tree a raccoon or corner a fox. Then a clear voice came from the edge of the river. "Somebody out there? Help me!" It was a colored woman's voice, sure as anything. "Help me!" she called. "Don't say a word," the man whispered over his shoulder to us. "We just gonna sit here real quiet and leave that woman be." Our boat drifted like a leaf on the water, and I looked up at the silent, hunched-over shadow of the man in front of us. A shiver of fear went straight through me. He was bigger than me and Harrison put together. What would happen to us? "Your death doesn't mean as much to me as mine." Wasn't that what he said? The woman on the riverbank called out again. Her voice was terrible and sad enough to harrow up the soul. I could hear the men in the cornfield growing louder. They could catch her in no time. "Help me! Somebody out there! Help me! Help me!" The riverman swore under his breath. Then I heard the oars hit the water as he swung them into the river. Leaning his shoulders into the oars, the man turned the boat. Instead of moving deeper into the river shadows, he pulled straight for the shore. We smacked hard into the riverbank this time that we just left from, and the man climbed out so fast it seemed as if he was trying to throw us into the water. "Over here! Over here," he called, spitting out a string of curses into the darkness. Next thing I saw was a cloud of fancy clothes in his arms. It tumbled into the other end of the boat, layers and layers of clothes, and with 2 brown hands and a pair of fancy lady slippers waving and kicking. The cloud stank to high heaven and flower perfume. "Careful of my pretty clothes," a voice babbled from the deep within the clothes, but the riverman splashed into the boat and splattering mud and water everywhere. He sat down in the middle, put his muddy boots right into the heap of fancy clothes. As far as I could see, there wasn't room for anyone else. Not with me and Harrison in one end and the lady piled in the other. "Lordy, I'm shaking like a leaf." The lady's voice kept on talking. "My name is Hetty Scott," she said, fluttering her brown hands into the air. "I run off from my mistress, and they's all chasing me. I don't know how much further I could have run in Miss Emma's fence." But the rest of Hetty Scott's words were frozen in the air as 4 dark shadows came tumbling down the riverbank into the water. Bloodhounds. And right behind the dogs were the sudden glow of lanterns and torches coming out of the fields like eyes. Men hollering and ran toward the riverbank, pointing at us. "Lord, save us!" Hetty Scott wailed. The riverman's voice thundered, "Get down! Get down!" As he leaned into the oars, there was a dark crack of gunshots from the shore, and a sound like stones skipping across the water. Only I knew it wasn't stones. "Put your head down, Samuel," Harrison hollered, pushing my head so hard that my chin smacked into my knees. More stones skipping across the water, and I whispered for Lily to save us now. It seemed like we were slowly slipping beneath the river. Cold water seeped in through the knee cloth of my trousers, and I could hear the water knocking on the sides of the riverboat. There were muffled sounds above, Harrison and the riverman hollering, a dog yelping, sounding like they had brought an oar down on one of the bloodhounds. There was more rifle shots further off, and then everything faded and grew quiet around us. "You still down there, Samuel?" I could feel Harrison lean over me. "Samuel!" He gave my arm a shake. I opened my eyes one at a time, making sure the night sky was still up there and the sides of the old riverboat was still around us. Had we got away? "They gone?" I asked, looking around. The riverman had his oars out of the water, listening too. I could hear the sound of the lady in the back of the boat crying loud, and I thought about Lily telling me, "You ain't allowed to cry unless folks is dying or dead." The way that lady was crying, we was all dying or dead. "She hurt?" I asked. "No," Harrison grinned and shook his head back and forth. "Ain't nothing wrong with her." He lowered his voice to the whisper. "But she sure do smell, don't she?" He waved his hand back and forth. "Whoo-wee! Wonder where she saw all that fancy perfumery." A loud ripple of laughter came flying out of my mouth. "You think getting away with your life is something to be laughing about, boy?" The riverman turned quick. "Well, you just keep on laughing." Then he smacked the oar. He hit me and Harrison with a wave of river water, hard as a hand slap. As me and Harrison gasped for air, the riverman's voice rumbled low and mean. "You two scraps of life ain't worth a thing, not one thing to white folks." He squeezed my arm and pointed into the darkness. "You gonna get to the other side of this river, boy, and open up your hand, and what you're gonna get inside is nothing. See if you laugh then," he said. "See if you laugh then." My eyes stung with tears as the man turned back to his oars. He was as mean as a snake. Even meaner, maybe. I couldn't figure out why he had gone and saved us from patrollers, and why he was rowing us across this river. He didn't care a straw about us. Not one straw. Harrison kept his head down, not saying a word, but I could hear Hetty Scott still softly babbling and crying to herself. The man leaned over her heap of clothes. "Don't want to hear another sound from you, or I'm going to toss you and your clothes in this river. Do you hear me?" he said harshly, and Hetty Scott's crying dried up like water. Breathing hard, the man kept on rowing up the river. Far-off voices drifted across the rippling blanket of water. In the night air, I could smell wood smoke and a sharp iron smell that made me think of the blacksmith hammering out shoes for Master Hackler's horses. Were the white folks on the riverbanks following us, I wondered? Floating logs thumped onto our boat. A flickering boat lantern passed by the middle of the river with two men singing to themselves in the darkness. Sounded like they were both rum drunk, so they never did see us. Slowly, our boat moved toward the shore, and not long after, the man said, "Keep still," and we scraped into the riverbank. Had we made it all the way across the river already? Wrapping a rough hand around my arm, the man pulled me to standing. "Come out and be quick about it, boy," he said. "Step down right here. Hurry now. It ain't deep." Heart pounding, I set one foot into the muddy river bottom. Behind me, Harrison climbed out, holding on to the side of the boat to steady himself. He grabbed the tow sack and waded into the shore. But it felt strange to stand on the Ohio River bank and look across the river toward the Kentucky side we had just left behind, because the truth was, the Ohio side didn't look any different than the dark Kentucky shore. It made me think of the time I stole a look into Miss Catherine's mirror and jumped at the sight of staring back from that silver glass. Looking across the River Jordan was just like staring in a mirror. One side was the same as the other. "You planning on climbing out?" The riverman looked at Hetty Scott, who was still sitting in the boat, staring wide-eyed from the layers of clothing that surrounded her. I could count 3 bonnets circling her face, and so many layers of fancy dresses and petticoats it was hard to tell where the clothing ended and she began. She fluttered her hands. "I can't climb out of that river." The man spat to the riverbank. "What were you planning to do when you got over here?" he said loudly. "Just parade around in white folks' clothing and shoes? Or did you figure you could steal some fancy clothes from your mistress and just run away?" "Lordy, I just don't know," Hetty Scott said, burrowing deep into her nest of clothes. "I just want some pretty things. Never had no pretty things before, you know." Her hands kept patting the big striped bonnet she wore, tied around the others, as if it was the only thing she had left in this world. I felt sorry for Hetty Scott, hearing the way that man was talking to her and knowing that we had a whole sack full of stolen stuff ourselves. When, quick as anything, that man reached into the river boat, picked up his pistol, and stuck it right in front of Hetty Scott's face. In his other hand, he held the knife that had been sitting on the seat. Hetty Scott gasped sharp, and her hands flew like two ribbons to cover her mouth. "You hear them coming across that river after you?" the riverman said low and mean. "You leave those fancy clothes behind, or I'm going to send you back into that river." He waved his pistol in the direction of the river. "That's your choice I'm giving you. I am not taking no fool with me." Hetty Scott sent up a wail when that would have wakened up the dead. "Let me keep my pretty clothes," she cried. "I'm taking my pretty clothes to Canada. I can't leave all my pretty clothes." Before me and Harrison could say a word, the man stuck the pistol in his pocket, grabbed the front of the boat, and pushed it deep into the water. Holding the side of the boat knee-deep in the river, the man said again, "Are you coming with us or not? You have 1/2 minute to answer me. Are you coming or not?" "Don't go and take my pretty clothes," Hetty Scott wept. "Please let me keep a hold of my pretty clothes. I never had pretty." With one strong heave, the man pushed the boat away. Me and Harrison watched like two stunned birds as the boat with poor Hetty Scott sitting inside began to make a slow, haunting turn into the river's current. Hetty Scott leaned over the side, waving her arms and wailing for us to help her. I could see her bonnets flying all which way and one oar dragging back in the water. And even as the boat's dark shape disappeared from our sight, I could still hear her sad crying voice echoing up the river. Fear crawled right up my spine. Saying nothing about what he had just done to Hetty Scott, the riverman waded out of the water, walked right past me and Harrison. I heard the hard snaps of twigs and brush as he stomped into the woods. "Samuel," Harrison said, pointing. "Go on. We're supposed to follow him." But I didn't want to follow a man's cold shadow that just disappeared among the trees. I figured he was just going to leave us somewhere, same as he done to poor Hetty Scott. Chapter 14. A Forest of Silence. "Who else are we going to follow?" Harrison hissed. "Can't just stand on the riverbank waiting for some patroller to come across the river and find us." Harrison started into the woods, carrying the tow sack and leaning on his walking stick. He waved his arm, telling me to hurry, but the riverman just was walking fast. Holding his pistol in one hand and his knife in the other, he weaved back and forth, cutting a crooked line into the trees and fallen logs. It made my legs feel like someone had set them on fire trying to keep up with him. As I followed his mean back, all kinds of questions circled inside my head. Why had he gone and done that to poor Hetty Scott when she didn't do anything wrong? Why had he brought us across this river at all? Couldn't he see us walking behind us? Where was he taking me and Harrison to? Then the man stopped, so sudden in the middle of the woods I almost jumped out of my skin. He stared hard at me. Had he heard the talking in my head? "How old are you, boy?" 11, I answered quiet, kept my eyes down. "That old man got a name?" "Harrison." "But he ain't that old," I lied. "He's only got rigor mortis from working his bones from working the fields his whole life." "Rigor mortis." The man gave a deep rolling laugh. Sounded like the laugh with something mean behind it, like summer thunder coming across the field. The man looked back at Harrison, who was hobbling so far behind that all you could do was see a speck of white. in the darkness. "I traveled with an old man once," he said. "When I was about 8, they chained me to an old Negro. Walked most of 100 miles together, Norfolk to Richmond, Virginia. And I remember plain as day how that old bent-over man held up most of the chain between us, trying to make those irons light for me." The riverman paused and looked at me. "You know what irons are, boy?" "No, sir." Reaching out quick, he circled his hands around my throat. "Collars. They fasten here, round your neck." His hands tightened, and fear stuck in my throat. In a voice that I tried to keep calm as water, I asked him what he had done wrong to be put in irons. "Wrong?" The man squeezed his hands, and my fingers flew to my throat, trying to pull his hands free. Even if he had let go, it felt like something stayed circled around my neck. "I was a slave boy, same as you," the man's voice rumbled. "Sold for the first time when I was 8, and a half dozen times after that." He gave me a hard look. "You never saw black folks in irons before? Or sold?" I thought of the picture I had of my mama. In my mind, I'd always seen her riding away like a white person sitting in the back of a wagon. Maybe truth was, they had chained her like the man was saying, chains around her neck like a dog, and walked all the way to Kentucky to be sold off. "See this?" The man traced his fingers down one jagged scar on his face. Your master ever beat you like this?" "No, sir," I whispered. "Know how I got my scars?" He held his arms pointing to all the scars, some jagged stripes, some round like pox marks. "You see what those are? Smallpox? Look." He held his arm closer. "They look like nail marks to you?" My throat tightened. I was beaten by a board with nails stuck through it. The man's voice kept on low and angry. "When I wasn't much older than you, my master came home, mad drunk one night, tore a board right off the wall, beat me till the blood ran down my skin in rivers." The man turned away. "Don't you forget what can happen to you," he said over his shoulder. "You don't watch your step, trouble will find your black skin too." And then he walked ahead, snapping branches like bones under his feet. The whole forest of silence grew up after his words. It seemed like the night air had pulled in its breath at hearing what the riverman just said. It seemed like the breath he had been taken right out of me, too. "Lord, Samuel!" Harrison's loud whisper made me jump. "Never thought I was going to catch up to you." He leaned hard on my shoulder. "Feel like I done walked my bones clear out of my feet. How about you?" "Yes," I said, my voice sounding strange and trembly. "That fella say something to you?" I tried to remember what Lily put in her turnover pies and the names of each one of the hogs Master Hackler had in the barn to keep me from thinking of the man's scars and what he had just said. "He tell you why he sent that poor lady into the river?" I shook my head. "Don't understand at all. Why would a fella go and do something like that? Send a poor lady out into the river just to be caught like that? Just 'cause she was out of her daylights and mixed up in them fancy clothes ain't no reason to do that. Don't understand it at all." Harrison sighed and shifted the tow sack from the one shoulder to another. Not looking back at us, the riverman followed a small creek through the woods. It twisted and turned like a piece of rope. He stayed to one side of the creek, moving through the places where the ground was soft and thick with moss. "That fellow knows where he's going. You can tell it," Harrison whispered as we walked. "He's taking us somewhere. My legs may not hold out long enough to get there, though. But he's taking us somewhere." It was almost light when we stopped at a clearing where a small house and frame barn sat. The house was made of neat brown bricks. It made me think of loaves of Lily's bread Lily's bread. Behind it, there was a gray barn that looked the same as Master Hackler's, only this barn was straight up, and Master Hackler sagged to one side, as if it had been standing in a strong wind too long. I noticed a yellow painted chair sitting in the tall grass near the house. If someone had left one of Miss Catherine's nice chairs outside, it would have put her in a fit, worse than I can imagine. My fingers inched to take the chair back into the house so someone wouldn't get themselves into trouble. The man stopped before we got near the house. It seemed like he noticed that yellow painted chair too, but he didn't say a word about it. "Keep quiet and listen close now," he said sharp, keeping his eyes fixed on the house and the woods. "Everything's all ready, looks like, but you do exactly as I tell you, understand?" He glared at us. "I'm going to go through this once before I leave." In the dim morning light, I could see the man was dog-tired himself. His big shoulders were slumped over like he had melted down, and the front of his shirt pressed against his skin with dark circles of sweat. River mud splattered his clothes all over. "You walk around the back of that house until you see a white-painted cellar door standing open with steps going down," the man said, pointing to the house. "You go and you hide yourself in that cellar. Could be a day, could be 2 or 3. There's food and blankets down there ready for you. So you just wait there and keep quiet until the white widow lady who lives in the house takes you to another." The man cut a look at Harrison. "Are you listening to what I'm saying, old man?" But Harrison was leaning on his walking stick, head held down, eyes closed. He looked as spent as I'd ever seen. Not even like himself anymore. The man turned to me. His voice hissed low and mean. "You got any sense?" I didn't dare look up, just nodded. "Then you heard what I just told the old man? You and him hide in that cellar and you keep quiet until the white widow lady comes and takes you to another safe place." In my mind, I tried to conjure up a picture of what kind of white lady would go around helping black folks, but I just couldn't. Lily always said Miss Catherine would cut off her right arm and sell her left before she'd lift a hand to help us, even if we were keeled over and dying. The man tapped my chest with the pistol. "You gonna remember what I told you in those woods? You gonna remember how I got all my scars, boy?" I nodded, keeping my eyes fixed on the front of his red shirt. "There's 2 things I learned when I got off like you and got away from my own master." He stuck the gun in his pocket, told me to look up. Slowly, I looked at the riverman's scarred, ruined face, his eyes staring at me like 2 bottomless holes. "First," he said, "you'll always walk as if you have the perfect right to do so. Same as white folks walk. Go on. Walk toward that tree." The riverman pushed me forward, and I stumbled, and then started across the clearing, walking the way I always do. He followed right behind me. "Draw attention to yourself," he said, giving me another push. "Don't scuttle around like some poor bent-over beetle carrying a few crumbs to his master. You a slave or are you free? Walk like it. Walk." 10 times or 20 times he made me walk back and forth between 2 trees, picking up my feet, keeping my back straight, swinging my arms, putting my nose in the air like I was smelling the wind. Leaning on his walking stick, Harrison stood and watched, saying nothing at all. "Wait." The man latched onto my arm and stopped me right in the middle of walking. "Say I'm a white fellow, maybe a patroller, who's caught hold of you. What are you going to do, boy?" My heart thumped on my chest. His rough hand squeezed my arm tighter. "You want to run?" he said. "Yes," came a whisper out of my mouth. "No," the man's voice rumbled. "You run and they know exactly who you are. Haste will always be your undoing. You wait, and you look for their weakness. Then you plan a way out. Never go running off. Understand?" He glared at me. "You have these things set down in your brain or not?" I nodded. "Walk. Don't haste." The man glanced over at Harrison. "Go and get me that old man of yours and tell him to bring me that bundle he's been carrying." Slowly and shuffling, Harrison brought over the bundle of stolen things. "Ain't nothing much in here but food and some clothes for me and Samuel," he said, keeping his eyes low. "We only run off with what belongs to us." But the man opened the tow sack like he owned it himself, saw Miss Catherine's bonnet, Master Hackler's boots, and all the other things, of course, With no expression on his face at all, he tied the bundle close. "I'll be taking your tow sack along with me," he said, lifting it to his shoulder. I thought about all the things inside that tow sack. The silver pocket watch Harrison was going to sell for money, the bridle for a horse that we thought we'd have someday, the blankets that belonged to me, the skillet from Lily's kitchen. "Wait," Harrison said. "Something wrong, old man?" The man gave Harrison a squint look, like Harrison was nothing more than a fly speck or a spot of dirt. Nothing that mattered much. Harrison cleared his throat. "There's a roll of old gray yarn in the bottom of that tow sack. Couldn't we keep a hold of that, maybe? It belongs..." He paused and looked at me. "It belongs to Samuel. Gray yarn." I stared at Harrison. What in the world was he talking about? Why would he ask for gray yarn? And why would it belong to me? Even the man seemed set back a little. He looked first at Harrison, then at me. Shaking his head, he lowered the bundle to the ground, untied it, hunting for the roll of yarn. "Here," he said, pulling out something and tossing it to me. I looked down at the small tangle of wool in my hands, and the riverman grinned, like it was something funny to see me holding nothing but yarn. "Don't suppose you thought to bring any money in that sack," he said, lifting the bundle in the air and shaking it hard. "Or were you thinking that little roll of gray yarn was going to buy you the things you need in this world, old man?" Harrison was silent. "Lucky for you, I got some spare money to give away." The riverman loosened a small leather pouch tied to his belt and nodded toward the brown house. "You going to pay that white widow lady for keeping you in that cellar, and other folks if they ask for money." He tossed the leather pouch to Harrison. "Remember where you put it, old man." But the pouch tumbled through Harrison's stiff fingers and jangled to the ground. "And one more thing," the riverman said, as he lifted the tow sack to his shoulder. "Slave catchers and patrollers, they have the right to hunt any old place they please. They come across that river and catch you here in Ohio, just same as Kentucky. You understand what I'm saying?" Harrison nodded. "There's nowhere in this whole United States that a runaway is safe," the riverman called over his shoulder. "You just remember that." And without another word, he turned and walked into the woods, his legs cutting up the ground like a big pair of saw blades. The last I saw was his red flannel back, carrying all of our things, disappearing between the trees. And me and Harrison hurried toward the house, just as the rooster crowed.